Welcome, everyone, and good evening. I'm Robert Klitzman. I'm a professor here at Columbia University in the medical school and the School of Public Health, and I direct the Masters of Bioethics program here. And we're deeply honored and privileged to have with us this evening Tony Fauci. Dr. Fauci, as many of you know, is one of the world's leading scientists. He served as the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease for 38 years, from 1984 to 2022, where he oversaw extensive research in HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, Ebola, Zika, and COVID, among others. He has advised 7 presidents on both domestic and global health issues. He was one of the principal architects of the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR, which has saved more than 20 million lives throughout the developing world. He is ranked as the 44th most cited living scientists in the world and ranks 9th of all authors in the field of immunology. He's received numerous awards, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest honor given to a civilian by the President of the United States. And he has also received the National Medal of Science. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the American Philosophical Society. He serves on many editorial boards. He has written or co-authored over 1,400 scientific presentations. And most recently, I should say, is the author of a wonderful new book, On Call, which is a memoir and autobiography, which I highly recommend to you all. Dr. Fauci, thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be with you. Thank you for having me.
So to start off, you have done amazing things in your life, extraordinary public service for several decades. You've inspired millions of people. What would you say have been the biggest rewards that you've had in your career?
Well, as you know, I've been at this a very long time. So I've been in the public service at the NIH for 54 years. And as you mentioned correctly, Dr. Glitzman, I was the director of NIAID for 38 years. So I had worn multiple hats during that more than a half a century of service. And I'll just mention a couple that actually, what I would consider giving me the biggest rewards. One is my basic science and clinical research career, in which, without many people knowing about it outside of the scientific community, I had the fortune to get involved in a project very early in my career where I developed the therapy for formerly fatal autoinflammatory diseases, the vasculitides, what we now call granulomatosis with polyarteritis or polyarteritis nodosa, which had a mortality of about 100%. And we developed some protocols which put them into 93% remission. That was very rewarding. That was in a very early part. I had just finished my chief residency in medicine just down the road from you guys at Cornell. And I came back to the NIH to do that. The other was as director of NIAID, where I developed the AIDS program there very early on. Literally, I got involved in it within months of the first case reports in the summer of 1981. And that program which I established was responsible, in collaboration with the pharmaceutical companies, for developing that whole line of antiretroviral drugs that now, when used in combination, have completely transformed the lives of persons with HIV. So to me, that's, probably the most, if not one of the most rewarding things that I've had in my career. And finally, one that is not a scientific accomplishment, but is a public policy accomplishment. And that is when President George W. Bush gave me the opportunity to be the principal architect of the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR, which now in its 21st year has saved 25 million lives. So that has to be something that feels very rewarding to me. And I feel privileged that he gave me the opportunity to put that program together back in 2003 and 2002.
Extraordinary work over decades is really inspiring to everyone or to countless people over the world. You've also faced many challenges, of course, scientifically and also in public policy. If you were to say, what have been the biggest challenges you face and how did you address them?
Well, the first challenge that was really, I believe, a profound challenge was when I decided to turn around the direction of that successful career that I briefly described to you when I was working in the field of autoimmunity and autoinflammatory diseases. And when I first saw in the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report in the summer of 1981 the first cases of what would turn out to be HIV, I made a decision that was, actually reacted to by my mentors as being a career-ending decision where I stopped what I was doing in a very successful trajectory of my career and devoted my time completely to taking care of and studying these individuals, almost exclusively young gay men who had this disease that was killing them within 12 to 15 months of the onset of symptoms. That was before the disease had a name. We were calling it GRID. And the other was when we didn't have an etiology until 3 years into the disease. That was one really challenging part of my career. The other was actually a situation in which I, as you well know, had to publicly disagree with the president of the United States. And when that was during COVID, when I did not have, and I don't have any political agenda. I'm completely apolitical. I'm not a Democrat or a Republican. I'm a scientist and a public health person. But during the time of the COVID pandemic, I was in the very uncomfortable position that I had to fulfill my responsibility to the American public, publicly disagree with the president of the United States. That was, the people who are on that in that bent who criticize me for it think I did it for political reasons. It was very painful for me to do that because I have a great deal of respect for the office of the presidency of the United States. So when you ask me what was some of the most challenging things, that was right up there with a very challenging aspect of the last few years.
So how do you have the fortitude to do that? A lot of people, public health has been under attack. You were under attack. Many people would have quivered in your shoes and given up, but you had the courage to stand up for science. Walk us back there. What was that like for you? What would you say?
I just felt very strongly about it, Dr. Glitzman. It isn't as if that there was any doubt what I had to do. I mean, something can be difficult and painful, but yet your resolve in doing it never ever faltered. I mean, I was standing up there on the right next to the president on the White House press room, and as soon as he started saying things that were not true, I said to myself, well, sooner or later, maybe today, I'm going to have to publicly disagree. And when one of the reporters asked me, do you agree with what was just said? And I had to step up to the microphone and say, no, actually, I don't. So when you ask what was it that allowed me to do that, it was just a conviction that you have to stick with the truth that's based on science and evidence and data. And once you veer off from that, it's kind of like a slippery slope where you lose respect for yourself and people lose respect for you. So the consequences, as you know, it has been very difficult for me since then because I unleashed a lot of the people who are very supportive of that administration who are now consider me, unfortunately, public enemy number one to them. And all I did was try to tell the truth.
Yeah. So public health in general is under attack, and many public health officials felt attacked at local levels, state levels, city levels. Any advice or suggestions for them, what they should do?
Yeah, they have to just stick with the data and the science. There's a lot of intermingling between politics and science now, which have created a sort of a blurry zone where people are anti-science, which you're not sure if that it has an element of political animosity there. Um, if you stick with the science, are transparent, admit what you don't know, and be, explain when you're talking about something that the evidence is not overwhelmingly conclusive. We were faced with that in the early months of COVID, where we were dealing with a moving target and things were changing from day to day to week. Understanding of how well the virus transmits. Is it transmitted in an asymptomatic way? Is it aerosol? Should you wear a mask or not? Those are the kind of things that, as the weeks and months went by, we got more information, which allowed us to modify what we were saying. But when you do that, you've got to explain to the American public or to the global public that the reason you're changing is because the information is changing.
Somehow, my sense is that you consistently gave that message that based on what we know now, this is what we recommend. This may change as we gain more information, but somehow I think for many listeners, that part got lost, so they didn't hear
Yeah.
that.
Well, I'm very gratified, Dr. Klitzman, that you picked that up, because people say, what would you have done different? I can count 1,000 times when I gave the qualification. This is what we know now, be it January 2020 or February 2020 or the summer of 2021. This is what we know now, semicolon, however, comma, this could change, and we've got to be prepared that it will change. You're absolutely right. The overwhelming majority of people, and that's probably because the press, and I'm not criticizing them for this. This is the nature of communication. The press likes short sound bites. They don't like the qualifications. They want, what did you say? And when you try to say however something, the however never gets in there. So that's the reason why people actually thought that either we were flip-flopping or we were not giving them the right information, which was not the case. Everyone was trying very hard to communicate the information in the correct way, the way it was evolving. And that's the key word. It was evolving.
So it seems there's a lot of misunderstanding of science and the way it works. What can we do about that?
Well, first of all, the long game of that has to be, we've got to try in our educational institutions and others to get people to be more science literate. And science literate, in my mind, does not mean being a scientist. It means understanding critical thinking and knowing what science is, that science is a process to collect information and data, and in and of itself, it's a self-correcting process. Very many people don't really get that. And I'm not being critical of it, but it's just people don't fully understand that. So first of all, we've got to get people to better understand science. And secondly, we've got to be out there talking more about what the truth is, what the data are, analyzing the data and talking about the data. We're existing right now, unfortunately, and that's one of the main problems, in an arena of the normalization of untruths. I mean, which is amplified dramatically by social media, where there are things that are said that are egregiously incorrect, proven to be incorrect, yet if you say it enough on social media, it becomes true to a lot of people, when in fact it's the farthest thing from the truth. I can't give you an easy solution to that, except to say that people who are sincere about getting correct information out should be a little bit more proactive in disseminating that correct information. I say sometimes tongue in cheek, but I'm not really being sarcastic, I'm being truthful. It seems that the people who spread misinformation and disinformation seem to be a very energetic group that when you see how much of it is coming, you wonder if they have a day job other than to just spread false information. And the people who are serious and sincere about getting correct information usually have a lot of other responsibilities and can't be online all day trying to correct misinformation.
What do you make of the virulence of the anti-vaxxers, for instance? I mean, where is that coming from, do you think? Or any thoughts on that?
I'm not an expert in the sociological aspects of that, but from the perch that I'm at, I think it's a complicated confluence of a number of factors. And it's one, a libertarian spirit, which, if it isn't pushed to its exaggeration, is a good thing. We have that free spirit in this country, which is a good thing, number one. Number two, it's the politicization of science in some ways. And there is a very well documented example of that, that if you look at the people who've been vaccinated and look at it with regard to red state versus blue state, Republican versus Democrat, is no doubt that there are less vaccination and acceptance of vaccination in COVID among people in red states versus blue states. And as it turns out, the number of hospitalizations and deaths tragically are more in states that are red states than blue states. That should never, ever happen, where someone's health of themselves and their family is compromised by decisions on health issues that are made because of a political ideology. That should never happen, but it's happening.
So speaking of that, you've had the unique experience of having worked with 7 presidents, both Democrats and Republicans, as well as other major political leaders. I'm wondering who's impressed you the most?
You're not going to get me to talk about the most or the least. I can make, some comments. My first real intense interaction. I mean, I did advise President Ronald Reagan in the very early years of my directorship of the Institute during the early years of HIV. I didn't get to know him very well. I got to know President George H.W. Bush very well as his son, George W. Bush. But with regard to the elder Bush, I think it's a great example is that he was a conservative Republican, but he was a fine gentleman with a high degree of integrity who cared about the country and cared about institutions. And you could agree or not with him ideologically as a conservative versus a progressive or a liberal, but he was a good man. Then you go to somebody like Obama, who was quite liberal, but also had the same degree of integrity, the same degree of respect for institutions, the same degree of honesty. So what that experience, and Clinton was the same way, as was Biden. But it actually manifests for me that political ideology and differences of opinion are good and healthy. It's when you get to divisiveness that things go bad. And that appears to be where we are right now in 2025 and 2024 and 2023, where the country is very, very divisive. So I had the experience with, the unique experience of being able to advise to a greater or lesser degree 7 presidents. And it just, emphasizes to me that ideological differences are good if it doesn't lead to profound hostility and divisiveness.
That brings us till today. And you work closely with President Trump in his first term, and you in your book you say that he is a complex man, personable but mercurial. I'm wondering, any thoughts or suggestions about how public health professionals and others who are concerned about the health of the country might best respond to him or work with him or interact with him?
Well, yeah, the advice I give, I get asked that all the time, is just stick with fundamental sound public health principles in what you do. And if you're getting asked for advice or for input into any policy, don't get involved in any of the political stuff and just stick with the science, with the facts, and with the core fundamental public health principles. If you do that, you may or may not be accepted, but at least you've done the thing that's the right thing to do. That would be my observation.
So have integrity.
Yes, I mean that's the critical issue.
Right. How about in terms of future generations and the next generation coming up of physicians, of public health people? Any suggestions about any advice for them? Any things we should be doing as we train them for the
Yeah.
next generation?
Yeah, I think right now, literally now being the end of January, the beginning of February of 2025, I think those of us, myself included, who are involved in teaching or mentoring the younger people who are going to be involved, who want to be involved in public health, my mentoring them is based on, first of all, telling them based on experience that I have and my colleagues have had, what a wonderful profession public health is, where you can actually devote all of your energy and your efforts to try and better the world by making the health of the world, our own country and the rest of the world, better. And those of us in the United States who are interested in public health and global health because of the leadership of the United States, um, what we do here is going to have positive impact throughout the world. So that's one thing that I do that I think we should impart upon the students. But the other thing is to tell them to please don't get discouraged and walk away from a field that you could be very, very satisfied with and get a great deal of gratification, because there's a lot of turmoil right now. You don't need me to say it. Even if I weren't on this program, all you need to do is see what's going on. There's a lot of turmoil in the arena of science, medicine, and public health. Stick with your fundamental principles, maintain your integrity, and you're going to be fine. And the field is going to be fine because it's an incredible vocation that, in many respects is pluripotential. You can do so many good things in the arena of public health. So don't get discouraged by what's going on right now and just stick with the good fundamental principles.
So your career has sort of been bracketed, or in some ways, by HIV/AIDS in the beginning and COVID now. Looking back at HIV, are there things you think one might have done differently? And also, what made you sort of so quickly realize this is an important issue to address?
Well, I think what the field could have done differently, I was in there hopefully fighting the good fight early on because I got involved. I was one of the few people in the country. There was a handful of us that were getting involved in admitting and studying individuals, taking care of them, and trying to do research. I think if the country could have done something different, it was during the very early years, if the administration and the leadership of the country had used the bully pulpit of the presidency and the administration to call attention to and give greater support towards HIV/AIDS in those very early years, that might have made things go better, particularly during those very difficult early years.
What led you to sort of get involved so early? As you say, you saw the first report in 1981 or so, and you sort of shifted your career. Did you know this was going to be big, or just it was exciting scientifically, or big from a public health point of view, or
You
something?
know, in many respects, Bob, I felt it in my gut that this was going to be a serious problem. As I mentioned, I had been involved for years following my chief residency in medicine in New York, I came down to the NIH, and for about 9 years, I got involved in that very successful career of inflammatory diseases. But after a while, the work that I'd done, which was adopted by people throughout the world that were using my protocols, the work we were doing was solid but incremental. And I was looking for a challenge. I was trained, I had my boards in internal medicine, my boards in infectious diseases, and my boards in clinical immunology and allergy. So all of a sudden, a brand new mysterious disease comes along that is killing almost everybody who gets afflicted with it. And it's a disease that epidemiologically at the time was crying out that it was an infection and a sexually transmitted infection, and it was destroying the immune system. So I said to myself, here I am, a trained infectious disease guy, a trained immunologist. It's almost as if I was trained to do this. And the other thing was I had a profound degree of empathy for the people who were getting afflicted because, the gay population was disenfranchised. They were discriminated against. They were stigmatized even before HIV. And then HIV comes along and they get like a double whammy. They're stigmatized for who they are, and then they're stigmatized for a disease that happened to afflict them. I just felt an overwhelming need to switch the direction of my career and devote myself essentially full time to HIV.
So to our audience, we have some wonderful questions coming in, so please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A box there. One question is, we developed, and you were very instrumental in developing a vaccine for COVID with sort of record speed, yet HIV, we still haven't developed a vaccine. What can you tell us about that, or what your thoughts are about that?
Yeah, it's the nature of the disease. So when you have a disease in which the body can make an adequate immune response to clear the pathogen, even if the disease can be serious and kill some people, at the end of the day, if the immune system is capable of making an adequate immune response, when you try to develop a vaccine, you imitate to the best of your ability without hurting the patient. You imitate natural infection. That's what a vaccine does in a safe way. So when you have diseases like measles, like polio, like smallpox, even though they can be serious diseases, at the end of the day, the body recovers and then you're protected against reinfection because you develop the immunity. So when vaccinologists years ago decided to develop vaccines for measles, for polio, for smallpox, they mimicked natural infection, and the body reacted the way you predict it would react. It made a very good response, and now we have very successful vaccines against measles, against polio, against smallpox, against many others. That is not the case with HIV for reasons that are still not fully understood. The body does not make an adequate immune response against natural infection. So if you want to make a vaccine for HIV, scientists are still struggling with how do you get the body to make an immune response that's even better than the response against natural infection. So it's a scientific problem. With COVID, it was a matter of just getting the job done because we know that we make good immune responses against coronaviruses because we get infected with common cold coronaviruses all the time. And yet the body knows how to make a good immune response. So what we did really was that we were able to do something that was unprecedented. We took a platform technology, which the NIH had been supporting for 15 or more years by a number of investigators, particularly Drew Weissman and Katie Carico, who won the Nobel Prize for the mRNA technology. And then we used the researchers who were working using structure-based vaccine design to develop an immunogen for HIV, they used that same technology to develop a very good immunogen for the spike protein of SARS-CoV-2. You put those two things together, you invest a lot of billions of dollars with Operation Warp Speed, and you have a vaccine 11 months after the sequence of the virus was made available. If you compare that with the usual 7 to 10 years to get a vaccine, that was an unprecedented accomplishment in biomedical research.
Amazing. So in terms of, a lot of people are concerned about the next pandemic, what may happen. So do you feel we're prepared for it or better prepared than we were for COVID? If not, what should we do? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I believe we're better prepared in some respects, and we have not yet fully learned the lessons of COVID or HIV to prepare us from a public health standpoint. So what I tend to do, Bob, I look at it in two separate buckets. I look at it as scientific preparedness and response, and then there's public health preparedness and response. We proved very, very clearly during COVID that the eloquence of the science that we've invested decades in allowed us to do something that was unprecedented, namely vaccines for COVID, monoclonal antibodies, drugs like Paxlovid that we got very, very quickly. So if we keep the support of biomedical research up and running in the way that we had before, we'll be fine. What we've got to do better at is our public health response. We've got to really modernize our local public health infrastructure that, that it was in many respects antiquated, almost a victim of our own success historically with getting vaccines and antibiotics, that the general public health infrastructure really was not up to the task. They worked hard, they did well, but unfortunately, they didn't have the tools they need. So we've got to build that up. The other thing is we've got to realize that the worst time to have a historic pandemic like COVID would be in an era where there is a profound degree of political divisiveness in the country. I mean, that was a bad combination to have that. The worst outbreak in over 100 years when the country was sort of at war with each other, as opposed to the common enemy, which was the virus.
So for public health infrastructure, how much of that is federal funding or state funding or local funding or other funding? Any thoughts?
No, it's both. It really is. I mean, it's a synergy between the federal government, which does give money to the states, but the states also have to essentially make the commitment at the local level that they're going to, hopefully in a unified way, get the information and the policy that's in accordance with the federal government, so that we do it in a way that's synergistic with each other and not against each other, where the federal government says one thing and the states go ahead and do it another way. I mean, states' rights are wonderful for other things, but when you're having a pandemic, you got to pull together.
Well, viruses don't know state borders or national.
No, not at all.
So a few questions are coming in about bird flu.
Yeah.
How concerned should we be?
Well, the CDC has said that the risk is still low, but apropos of our prior conversation, Bob, it's semicolon, however, this could change. And let me explain. Bird flu has been around for a long time. The H5N1 was discovered like in 1959. It first infected a human in 1997. And then there have been multiple outbreaks of different bird flus with the H5N1. The concern is that in an outbreak that started in 1997 in Hong Kong, when it infected a considerable number of people, the mortality was anywhere from 30 to 50%. So the concern is, even though we have 67 cases of bird flu in the United States right now, the bird flu that's infected humans They've infected millions of birds and over 900 herds of cattle. And the concern is that it will evolve and adapt itself so that when it infects a human, it won't be just a one-off the way it is now, where a human might get infected, but they don't infect somebody else. Where if it adapts itself to spread efficiently from person to person, we could be in a lot of trouble. That's what people are concerned about. Even though in general, the Public Health Service, the CDC, the WHO all say that the risk is still low, which it is, but we really have to keep an eye out on it.
So in other words, the risk of it mutating to
Exactly.
have human-to-human transmission is low, you think?
Yeah. But it's not zero, and that's the reason why we have to monitor it very carefully.
Right. And your book, by the way, I thought was wonderful. Really, even though I followed your career in at many points, I was amazed by the depth and breadth of what you've done. Do you want to talk a little bit about what made you write the book, or the reactions you're getting to it?
Well, the reactions, thankfully, are very, very positive. It jumped up to #1 on the New York Times bestseller list right away, and it stayed there for a while, and people seem to enjoy it, which makes me very happy because I worked very hard on making it an easy, good read, which I think it is. The reason I did it is somewhere about right at the middle or so of the Clinton administration, I said to myself, this is interesting. I've been advising multiple presidents, and I'm still a relatively young person, and I know I'm going to be around for a while, I hope. So why don't I start documenting very, very clearly what my experiences are? And then when I was getting ready to think about stepping down, I said to myself, now that I've had a long career of science and public health, what I would like to do for the next couple of years is perhaps and hopefully serve as an inspiration for younger people who might be interested in a career in public service and public health. So when I stepped down in December of 2022, I spent the next year doing nothing but sitting down and writing that book that you referred to. So I really wanted it to be two things: a historical perspective from one individual who was in the unique position to see and do things that very few people had the opportunity to do. And the other reason for writing it was to serve as an inspiration for younger people who are interested in going into public service.
So other thoughts on that? We spoke a little bit about sort of the rewards you felt and lessons. Other messages for young people who are thinking of public service or public health?
I say that in the epilogue to the book, where I say, now that I'm essentially stepping down from the activity to just try and inspire people, my message to people is that the field of public health and public service is so gratifying. I mean, if you have even the slightest inclination to do it, it's very difficult to describe that wonderful feeling you get when you've done something, with a lot of work that might help people, individual people and populations of people, which is what global health is, the health of populations of people.
So gain of function research has been controversial and there's a lot of misunderstandings about it. Do you want to maybe talk a little about what it is? And
Yeah, I think you probably described it in a succinct way, Bob, as accurate as you could say. There's a lot of misunderstanding of gain of function, which is synonymous to many people of something bad and evil and dangerous. Well, you've got to make sure you define what you're talking about, because there's a lot of research going on every single day that is what's called gain of function, namely giving to a pathogen or something else an attribute they didn't have before. So I'll give you a couple of examples of really good gain of function that many people participate in the rewards of. When you make an influenza vaccine, you generally grow it in eggs. And the virus has to grow in eggs so you could harvest it and make your vaccine. What scientists have done for decades and decades is give the influenza virus the gain of function by mutating it so that it grows very well in eggs, so you can get enough virus to turn into a vaccine.
Mm.
So the vaccines that you and I got for flu was the result of gain of function. That's good gain of function. Also, if you take a bacteria and stick the gene of insulin into it and make it pump out insulin, you're giving that bacteria gain of function. So when people say gain of function, everybody goes, oh my God, gain of function is bad. So then what is the gain of function that you should be concerned about? And that is, if you do an experiment that somehow could possibly have some danger of a bad effect, escape or what have you from it, that you've got to do that with the best guidelines by highly trained people in facilities that can handle it. That would be called gain of function of concern. And there are some strict definitions that we've used. Some people might disagree with some of those definitions, but not all gain of function research is something that you need to worry about. So when you talk about gain of function that you're concerned about, you've got to specifically define what you're talking about. And the big confusion, as you alluded to with the question, is that when people say gain of function, they lump it all in one big group. And that is very misleading.
So it's come up in the context of COVID. Do you want to talk about that at all? Some of the misunderstanding about that, perhaps?
In what way, Bob?
Well, I'm there. Well, to be blunt, there are people who say, "Oh, this, that NIAID funded gain of function research in China that
Yeah.
deliberately led to COVID,"
Well,
kind of thing.
yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, actually, if you just look at the facts and take the accusations and the emotion out of it, and you say, what were the viruses that? First of all, the NIH subaward was $120,000 a year award in a $6 billion budget. So it was not exactly a lot of activity. And the reason for the research was that the group there that's being maligned, a lot, the group that got the subaward from an organization in New York, EcoHealth, is a group that has done very, very fine research with a track record that is very, very well respected in the scientific community. And the purpose of the research was to do surveillance of the bat population in China to determine if there are viruses out there that have the potential, not to do anything to change them, to make them more transmissible or make them more pathogenic, just to find out if they had the capability of even binding to human cells. Now, the viruses that we used, if you have any experience in evolutionary virology, you'll know that those viruses were evolutionarily so far distant from SARS-CoV-2 that they could never possibly turn into SARS-CoV-2, even if you tried to do it. So this myth that those viruses were turned into SARS-CoV-2, if you talk to any evolutionary virologist who knows a little bit about evolutionary virology, they'll say that can't happen. It just can't happen. Now, having said that, I want to be perfectly transparent and honest that we don't know what the origin is of SARS-CoV-2. It very well may have been a lab leak from some lab that we don't know about in China. More likely, according to the evolutionary virologist, it evolved naturally from an animal reservoir in the Wuhan market. So what I say is I keep a completely open mind that we don't know definitively where it came from. I don't see any evidence that it came from a lab leak. Despite a lot of talk about it, I have yet to see a piece of evidence that it comes from a lab leak. There are other people, not me, but evolutionary virologists from Australia, Canada, the EU, UK, the United States, who've studied this very carefully and published in the peer-reviewed literature, like in the journals Science and Cell, that the data that they have found strongly suggests, though it doesn't definitively prove, but strongly suggests that it was from a natural occurrence jumping from an animal. So again, like I said, I have an open mind that it could be either, but I think the evidence weighs much more strongly towards a natural occurrence.
So just switching topics a little bit, the US being part of WHO. So we have been for many years. Then we weren't under Trump, then we were under Biden. Now we're not, it looks like. If you were to say, why should the US be part of WHO, what would you say?
Well, WHO is an organization that the world needs. You need a central organization that can help coordinate activities for the purpose of preserving the global health. So if you're going to talk about global health, the United States, which is a very powerful, important country, the most important and powerful in the world, should be a part of WHO. Now, does WHO need to be reformed in some respects? Yes. It is not a perfect organization, and it has made some missteps. So when people say we need to have some improvement and reforming of the WHO, all of us in public health agree with that. But we don't believe that the solution is to pull out completely from WHO. I think if you look at any of the scientists and public health people in the United States or worldwide, overwhelmingly, they would say that we need to be in WHO.
So here's a question. This is from a junior clinical investigator. If you were starting your career in the current climate of healthcare, et cetera, in the US, what would you focus your research on?
And it doesn't have to be global health, does it?
No, anything.
Anything. Well, I'm very fascinated in the interface between getting back to my roots of immunology and infectious diseases, of what is it about certain infections that trigger in genetically susceptible people autoimmune phenomenon, inflammatory diseases that can lead to myocardial infarctions. I mean, it's no secret when you get a severe viral infection, it triggers in some people an ultimate autoimmune disease. I mean, we know that there's everything from rheumatoid arthritis to lupus to other things that manifest themselves following infection. You have long COVID, which is an absolutely fascinating phenomenon that's related in many ways to what's being called myalgic encephalitis chronic fatigue syndrome, where people get a virus of some sort where you don't recognize, and then they get persistent symptomatology. The interesting thing about COVID is that we know what the virus is in COVID. So I would be, if I had to do like starting from scratch now, I would try to figure out what those mechanisms are that lead to a post-viral perturbation of the immune system that leads to manifestations, many of which appear to be immunologically mediated.
So a few questions about ethics and bioethics. So I'm wondering, my sense is there are many ethical policy and underlying ethical challenges you faced or questions. I'm wondering if you might talk about some of those or how you address them or more difficult ones you may have faced.
Yeah, well, there are a few. So, for example, in the clinical trials, when we were trying to modify the rigidity of the regulatory process and the rigidity of the clinical trial entry and exclusion criteria at a time when virtually everybody in the beginning of the HIV was dying within 12 to 15 months, that I felt it was sort of, ethically important for us to preserve the integrity of the science, but to get interventions to people who needed them without compromising the science. That was one ethical dilemma.
Mm.
The other ethical thing that was compelling for me is that when we developed the very, very effective, transformative drugs for HIV that made it go from a sure death sentence in many respects, not everybody, but most people would be an inevitable death sentence, to getting people to live normal lives with almost the normal lifespan with the triple combination. And yet, in the developing world, because of where someone was born, they would die from a disease that was preventable and treatable with therapies that were easily available in the developed world, were not available in the developing world. I thought of that as a real ethical issue. And that's the reason, together with President George W. Bush, that we pushed hard and developed the PEPFAR program. That was another ethical consideration. The third ethical challenge that I think we faced was when COVID came, the disparity in the distribution of life-saving vaccines. And that's what, speaking of the WHO, what the WHO is trying to do now, looking forward, is to get some sort of an agreement among countries, particularly the rich countries of the world, that if we get another pandemic, to make sure that foremost in our minds, among other things, is to get an equity of distribution of life-saving interventions, be they a vaccine or a therapy or a diagnostic or what have you. So those are three issues of ethical concern that I've had over the years.
So a few questions about how do we restore public confidence in science? And as part of that, what should we be doing on social media, if anything? Those of us who are concerned about public health and science, for instance, is that a way to go, either people's personal social media or professionally? How do we deal with this larger problem of distrust?
Yeah. Well, I can say, Bob, it's not going to be easy. I can tell you that it's very difficult because people are entrenched in their anti-science views. I think one of the, at least my experience with dealing with problems like this, is we can't be confrontational with people. We've got to try and reach out in a way that is, in some respects, understanding where they're coming from and even respecting where they're coming from, but really trying to engage in a dialogue with them to let facts and data and evidence be the thing that determines what direction you go and what your feeling is about science. I mean, because, the truth, comparing the truth with fantasy and conspiracy theory, I mean, unless somebody, really is warped in a way, I think they're going to realize that, evidence is what counts.
Yeah. We just have a few minutes left. I've asked you a lot of questions. I mean, other comments you'd like to make to our audience or thoughts, or I have a few other questions I could ask, but I just thought I'd see if.
Well, I mean, I'd be happy to entertain other questions, but I just think that in my mind, the younger people that I'm at Georgetown now, and it was the same when I was at the NIH. I'm so impressed by the energy, the talent, the intelligence of younger people, and how in my own career, the science over the more than half a century that I've been doing this has been spectacular in how it's advanced over those years. And I tell the younger people who are interested in things like public health or science or medicine or what have you, that the opportunities that you're going to have in the coming years are going to make what I've experienced, seem minor league, as a matter of fact, because clearly the scientific opportunities are going to allow the younger generation to do things that we never dreamed of. The same way, the developing therapies for HIV and the development of a vaccine in 11 months. My mentors back in the late 60s and early 70s never would have imagined that that would have been possible. So my word to them is, you got a great future ahead of you. So go for it.
One, two last questions, and all wonderfully inspiring words there. The media. So, any ways we could communicate better with the media? If you were talking to a group of journalists, or the things they should do differently, perhaps?
Well, if you asked me that question and said the media, I would say, well, you can give a uniform answer, be clear, make your message be crisp and clear, admit when you don't know something, be humble about things. But when you have social media as part of the media, and unedited social media that seems to be getting worse and worse with the dissemination of disinformation, I'm at a loss about, how we're going to counter that, except, as I mentioned in the beginning of our discussion, being more energetic in spreading through social media the correct evidence-based, data-based information.
All very important. We're just about out of time. So first I want to just say what a wonderful book this is. And I recommend it to everyone. And we've had many questions come in that we don't have time to answer, but I think, Tony, you did a wonderful job in answering a lot of those questions in the book itself. So to those who haven't read it, I recommend you take a look at it. And again, thank you all for joining us. And most of all, Tony, thank you so much for a fabulous discussion, and your insights and your courage and your example, I think, are just marvelous and really inspiring for millions of people all over the world. So thank you for that, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure to be with you, Bob. Thank you so much. And
Great.
thank you for the audience for participating. Appreciate it. Take care.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. And we have, before you go, just a few other upcoming events you might find of interest. Kate, I don't know if there's a slide you can bring up with some of those on. But check out our website, and we'll be sending out an email to those of you who are able to attend about some of our other upcoming events as well. We hope you could join us for those. And we'll be sending out a link of a copy of this evening's event as well. So also check out our website for Columbia Bioethics. We have lots of free events and courses and degrees and information on our website that you might find of interest as well. So with that, thank you so much again for joining us. Have a wonderful evening, and we look forward to being in touch. Take care. Have a good night. And again, enormous thanks to Dr. Fauci. Bye-bye.